One bullet. 4 years. 20 million dead. The First World War. On the morning of June 28, 1914, a 19-year-old man named Gavrilo Princip stood on a street corner in Sarajevo with a pistol in his pocket. He was not a professional assassin. He was sick, possibly with tuberculosis. He had failed once already that morning, watching as a different conspirator's bomb missed its target. By all accounts, he should have failed completely. The royal motorcade had taken a wrong turn, then stopped, by pure accident, almost directly in front of where Princip happened to be standing. He fired twice. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie were dead within the hour. 5 weeks later, the armies of Europe were marching to war. By the time it ended, 4 years later, more than 16 million people were dead. Empires that had ruled for centuries had collapsed. The map of the world had been redrawn. And humanity had discovered, in the mud of Belgium and France, exactly how much industrial technology could do to the human body when aimed at it for years without stopping. Welcome to Sera History. I'm your host. Episode 12. Today we talk about the First World War. And I want you to hold one question in your mind as we go through this. How does a single act of violence in a city most Europeans could not have located on a map become a war that consumes an entire civilization? The answer is not simple. But it is one of the most important stories in modern history, because we are still, in many ways, living inside the world that war created. To understand why one assassination could ignite a continent, you have to understand the powder keg that Europe had become by 1914. For decades, the great powers of Europe had been locked into a system of alliances. Germany and Austria-Hungary, joined later by Italy, formed the Triple Alliance. France, Russia, and Britain formed what became known as the Triple Entente. These alliances were meant to provide security. If everyone is bound to defend everyone else, the theory went, no one would dare attack. The theory failed completely. What the alliance system actually created was a tripwire. Pull on any single thread, and the whole structure would be dragged into motion. Germany itself was a relatively new nation, unified only in 1871 under the leadership of Prussia and the political genius of Otto von Bismarck. It had grown with stunning speed into an industrial and military powerhouse, and it wanted what it believed it deserved. Colonies. Naval power. Respect as a great power equal to or greater than Britain and France. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who took the throne in 1888, was a different kind of ruler than Bismarck had managed. Impulsive, insecure, obsessed with naval power, deeply resentful of his British relatives, Wilhelm pushed Germany into an arms race with Britain, building battleship after battleship in a competition that consumed enormous resources and convinced British leaders that Germany intended eventually to challenge their naval supremacy directly. Meanwhile, in the Balkans, the slow collapse of the Ottoman Empire had created a power vacuum that Austria-Hungary and Russia both wanted to fill. Serbia, newly independent and fiercely nationalistic, dreamed of uniting all South Slavic peoples, including those living inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire, into a single Slavic state. Austria-Hungary, a sprawling multi-ethnic empire already struggling to hold together Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Croats, and a dozen other nationalities, saw Serbian nationalism as an existential threat. This is the context into which Franz Ferdinand traveled to Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, a province Austria-Hungary had formally annexed only 6 years earlier, deeply resented by Bosnian Serbs who wanted union with Serbia. Princip was a member of a Serbian nationalist secret society called the Black Hand. He believed, along with his co-conspirators, that killing the Archduke would help free South Slavic peoples from Austrian rule. He could not have known what he was actually starting. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for the assassination, which was at least partially fair, since the Black Hand had connections to Serbian military intelligence. Austria-Hungary wanted to crush Serbia once and for all, but they were nervous about Russia, which saw itself as the protector of Slavic peoples and had backed Serbia in previous crises. So Austria-Hungary went to its ally, Germany, and asked for support. Germany gave what is now called the blank check, an assurance of unconditional support for whatever Austria-Hungary decided to do. This was the single most consequential diplomatic decision of the crisis. With Germany's backing secured, Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia on July 23, with demands so severe that they were almost designed to be rejected. Serbia accepted nearly all of them but balked at allowing Austrian officials to operate inside Serbian territory. It was not enough. On July 28, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austro-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia began mobilizing its army to support Serbia. Germany saw Russian mobilization as a direct threat and declared war on Russia on August 1. France was allied with Russia, so Germany declared war on France 2 days later. Germany's war plan, the famous Schlieffen Plan, required invading France through Belgium to avoid France's fortified eastern border. Belgium was neutral, guaranteed by treaty, including by Britain. When German troops crossed into Belgium on August 4, Britain declared war on Germany. In the space of about 1 week, 5 major powers had gone from peace to total war, dragged along not by deliberate choice in most cases, but by a system of treaty obligations, military timetables, and a deep, almost theological belief that mobilization, once started, could not be stopped without catastrophic military disadvantage. The generals told the politicians that the trains, the supply schedules, the entire logistics of moving millions of men could not simply be paused and restarted. Once you started the machine, you had to let it run. Nobody truly wanted this war. And almost everybody got dragged into it anyway. In the opening weeks, almost every government believed the war would be short. Soldiers marched off expecting to be home by Christmas. German strategy called for a quick knockout of France through Belgium, followed by turning east to deal with the slower mobilizing Russians. It almost worked. German forces swept through Belgium and into northern France with terrifying speed. By early September, they were within 30 miles of Paris. And then, at the Battle of the Marne, French and British forces, including troops famously rushed to the front in Parisian taxicabs, stopped the German advance. Both sides dug in. They began constructing trenches to hold their positions. Neither side anticipated that those trenches would become a network stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border, occupied by millions of men, for the next 4 years. This was the birth of trench warfare, and it represents one of the great horrors of modern military history. Picture 2 parallel lines of trenches, sometimes separated by mere yards, sometimes by hundreds, with a strip of churned, cratered, barbed wire-strewn ground between them that soldiers called no man's land. Picture machine guns capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, positioned to cover every inch of that ground. Picture artillery so powerful and so plentiful that entire landscapes were permanently transformed, forests turned to splinters, towns turned to rubble, the earth itself pockmarked with craters that still scar the French countryside today, more than a century later. For 4 years, generals on both sides repeatedly ordered massive infantry assaults across no man's land, believing that enough men, enough courage, enough artillery preparation could finally break the deadlock. It almost never worked. Machine guns and artillery had made traditional infantry assault tactics, the tactics that had won wars for centuries, into instruments of mass suicide. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties on the first day alone. Nearly 20,000 dead in a single morning. The battle continued for months. By the time it ended, over 1 million men from both sides were dead, wounded, or missing. The Allies had advanced roughly 7 miles. At Verdun, also in 1916, French and German forces fought for 10 months over a fortress city that had limited strategic value. The German plan, explicitly stated by its architect General Falkenhayn, was not even to capture territory. It was to bleed France white, to kill so many French soldiers defending Verdun that France would be forced to negotiate. Around 700,000 men were killed or wounded at Verdun. Neither side gained a decisive advantage. This is the horror at the center of the First World War. Industrial technology had outpaced military tactics by decades. The weapons could kill at a scale and speed never before possible. The generals were still thinking in terms of cavalry charges and infantry lines from the previous century. The result was slaughter on a scale that had no historical precedent. The war was not confined to the trenches of the Western Front. On the Eastern Front, Russia fought Germany and Austria-Hungary across a vast, more mobile battle line stretching across Poland and into Russia itself. Russian forces suffered catastrophic losses, partly due to poor leadership, inadequate supplies, and an economy unable to sustain the demands of industrial war. By 1917, Russian soldiers were deserting in massive numbers, exhausted, starving, and increasingly radicalized. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire, which had entered the war alongside Germany and Austria-Hungary, fought the British in campaigns across Mesopotamia, Palestine, and the Arabian Peninsula. It was here that a British officer named T.E. Lawrence, who became known as Lawrence of Arabia, helped organize and support an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule, promising Arab leaders independence in exchange for their support, promises that Britain and France would later largely break when they secretly carved up the Middle East between themselves in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The consequences of those broken promises and that secret carving up of territory still shape conflicts in the Middle East today, over a century later. At Gallipoli, in 1915, British, French, Australian, and New Zealand forces attempted to seize control of the strategically vital Dardanelles Strait, hoping to open a supply route to Russia and potentially knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war entirely. The campaign was a catastrophic failure, with Ottoman forces under the command of a young officer named Mustafa Kemal, who would later be known as Ataturk and become the founder of modern Turkey, successfully defending the peninsula. The Allies eventually withdrew after suffering enormous casualties. For Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli became a defining national memory, commemorated every year on Anzac Day, a moment when these young nations felt they had forged their own identity in the fire of war, even in defeat. The war also reached into Africa, where colonial forces fought campaigns largely forgotten by Western history books, and into the Pacific, where Japan, allied with Britain, seized German colonial possessions. This was, truly, a world war. Soldiers from India, from Senegal, from Algeria, from Vietnam, from across the British and French colonial empires, fought and died in a conflict that had nothing to do with their own nation's interests, conscripted or recruited into the armies of empires that, in many cases, did not even grant them full citizenship. At sea, the war introduced a new and terrifying weapon: the submarine. Germany's U-boat campaign targeted not just military vessels but merchant shipping, attempting to starve Britain into submission by cutting off its supply lines. This included attacks on civilian passenger ships. In May 1915, a German U-boat torpedoed the British passenger liner Lusitania off the coast of Ireland. Nearly 1,200 people died, including over 100 Americans. The sinking caused international outrage and pushed American public opinion further against Germany, although the United States would not enter the war for nearly 2 more years. Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare campaign, resumed in 1917 after a period of restraint, was one of the key factors that finally brought the United States into the war. The other was the Zimmermann telegram, a secret German diplomatic communication intercepted and decoded by British intelligence, proposing a military alliance with Mexico against the United States in exchange for Mexico recovering territory lost in the Mexican-American War. When the telegram was made public, American public opinion shifted decisively. President Woodrow Wilson, who had campaigned for re-election in 1916 partly on having kept America out of the war, asked Congress for a declaration of war in April 1917. The United States entered the conflict, bringing with it enormous industrial capacity and millions of fresh troops, exactly when the exhausted armies of Europe desperately needed them. Meanwhile, inside Russia, the strain of war had become unbearable. The Russian economy, never strong, collapsed under the demands of industrial warfare. Soldiers at the front had inadequate weapons, inadequate food, and leadership that seemed indifferent to their suffering. At home, food shortages and inflation drove ordinary Russians to desperation. In February 1917, the strain finally broke. Spontaneous protests and strikes in Petrograd escalated into a full revolution. Tsar Nicholas II, the absolute ruler of Russia, abdicated. A provisional government took power, attempting to continue the war while also managing a country in revolutionary chaos. It failed at both. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in a second revolution. One of their first acts was to negotiate Russia's exit from the war, signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in March 1918, ceding enormous territories in exchange for peace. Russia was out of the war. But Russia would soon descend into a brutal civil war of its own, and the world had gained its first communist state, an event whose consequences would shape the entire 20th century. For Germany, Russia's exit seemed like a gift. With the Eastern Front closed, German forces could be transferred west for one final offensive, launched in the spring of 1918, attempting to win the war before American troops could arrive in overwhelming numbers. The spring offensive came remarkably close to breaking through Allied lines. But it ultimately exhausted German forces without achieving a decisive victory. By summer, with fresh American troops arriving and Allied forces counterattacking with new tactics combining infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft in coordinated assaults, the tide turned decisively. By the autumn of 1918, Germany's situation had become hopeless. Its allies were collapsing. Austro-Hungary, an empire that had held together dozens of different nationalities for centuries, was disintegrating from within as Czechs, Poles, Hungarians, and South Slavs declared independence. The Ottoman Empire was also collapsing, its territories being seized by Allied forces and Arab revolutionaries. Inside Germany itself, the strain of total war had produced widespread hunger, exhaustion, and growing political unrest. In early November, German sailors mutinied at the naval base in Kiel. Revolutionary unrest spread across the country. Kaiser Wilhelm II, recognizing that his position was untenable, abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. A new German Republican government requested an armistice. On November 11, 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the guns finally fell silent. The war was over. It had lasted 4 years, 3 months, and 2 weeks. The casualty figures are almost too large to comprehend as individual human lives. Estimates vary, but somewhere around 9 to 11 million military deaths, and a roughly similar number of civilian deaths from war-related causes including famine and disease. The influenza pandemic that swept the world starting in 1918, made deadlier by the movement of soldiers and the weakened state of war-torn populations, would go on to kill tens of millions more. An entire generation of young European men had been decimated. In Britain alone, roughly 720,000 men were killed, a number that meant nearly every town, every village, every family had someone to mourn. The peace that followed proved, in many ways, almost as consequential as the war itself. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed harsh terms on Germany. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, to pay enormous reparations, to cede territory, and to drastically limit the size of its military. French leaders, having suffered catastrophic destruction across their northeastern territories, wanted Germany permanently weakened. British and American leaders were somewhat more cautious, but the final treaty leaned heavily toward punishment. The economist John Maynard Keynes, present at the negotiations, warned at the time that the treaty's economic provisions were so harsh that they would produce disaster. He was right, though the disaster took different and more catastrophic forms than even he predicted. The war also redrew the map of the world in ways that still shape global politics. The Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved entirely, replaced by new nations including Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Austria, and Hungary, many of them containing the same ethnic tensions that had helped ignite the war in the first place. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, its Middle Eastern territories carved up by Britain and France into new mandates and borders that bore little relationship to the ethnic, religious, and tribal realities on the ground, borders that remain sources of conflict to this day. The Russian Empire was gone, replaced by the Soviet Union. A new international body, the League of Nations, was created with the hope of preventing future wars through collective security and diplomacy. It would prove tragically unable to stop the catastrophe that was coming. Because the peace of 1919 did not actually resolve the underlying tensions that had caused the war. It simply paused them, while planting new resentments, particularly in Germany, where the harsh terms of Versailles, combined with economic collapse and hyperinflation in the early 1920s, created exactly the conditions of humiliation and desperation that a new generation of extremist politicians would later exploit. Many historians describe the period between 1918 and 1939 not as peace, but as an intermission. A pause between two acts of the same catastrophe. So what do we take from the First World War, more than a century later? We take, first, a warning about how alliance systems and military timetables can drag rational people into irrational catastrophe. None of the major leaders of 1914 actually wanted the war that resulted. They wanted, variously, to support an ally, to deter an enemy, to avoid looking weak. The mechanisms they had built to provide security instead manufactured the largest war the world had yet seen. We take a warning about the gap between technology and wisdom. Humanity had developed machine guns, heavy artillery, poison gas, tanks, and airplanes faster than it had developed the political and military judgment to use them responsibly, or to recognize when old tactics had become suicidal in the face of new weapons. We take a recognition of how war reshapes the world long after the guns fall silent. The borders drawn in 1919, the empires destroyed, the revolutions enabled, the resentments planted, all of it continued to shape global events for the rest of the century and beyond. And we take, perhaps most importantly, a recognition of just how much suffering ordinary people are capable of enduring and inflicting when nations decide that their pride, their alliances, their fear of looking weak, matter more than the lives of the people who will actually do the fighting and dying. A 19-year-old man with tuberculosis and a pistol could not have known, standing on that street corner in Sarajevo, that he was about to trigger the deaths of millions of people he would never meet, the collapse of empires that had stood for centuries, and the reshaping of the entire modern world. But that is the terrifying lesson of 1914. Sometimes the systems we build to keep us safe are the very systems that, once triggered, cannot be stopped. The First World War was supposed to be the war to end all wars. It was not. 21 years after the armistice was signed, the guns would start firing again, on an even larger scale, with even more horrifying consequences. But that is a story for another episode. This has been Sera History, Episode 12. If this story made you think about how fragile peace really is, how easily the machinery of nations can override the wishes of the people inside them, share it with someone who needs to hear it. We will be back. There are always more stories. History is not behind us. It is us.